This is Gemara in Gittin Daf Pei. Hey, we're holding on Pei Dalid Amud Beis. We did pull up a drop short. We're about 10 lines from the bottom, the two dots. Kisvai b'seichai. The Gemara here is quoting that which we learned in the Mishnah, the case that the Baal wrote it into the get, wrote the Tanai that your materis l'chol adam chutz mei ploini, and then he erased it. What's the halacha? The halacha is the get is pasul. Even if when he gives it to her, he says to her, no, you're mutter to everyone. But once the get was written bipaslos, once the get was written with a lack of krisos, it is not a good get. So says the Gemara, Omar Rav Safra, Kisvai b'seichai tanan, that the case of the Mishnah is, says Rav Safra, if he wrote it in the get, but if he merely said it, he didn't actually write it into the get, then the halacha is it will be kosher. Says the Gemara, Pshita, Kisvai b'seichai tanan, Shkoyach. That's what the Mishnah says. So explains the Gemara, I would have thought that when is it written? It's only if you wrote it la'achar ha'tayrif, after the tayrif, which is the ikr, the main part of the get, which includes all the main parts, the name of the husband, wife, and the date. That's when I would have thought it's a problem. Excuse me, hanimi la'achar ha'tayrif. I would have thought that's only if it's after the tayrif, because since the get itself was written without any tanai. But aval ifnei ha'tayrif, I would have thought afilu al pen nami pasul. If it was written into the get, if it was said before the tayrif, I would have thought even al peh, even b'tanai, orally would be pasul. Kamash mlan, that's the chiddush of Rav Safra, which he's teaching us that even in the case where it's said before the tayrif is written, it is still kosher. That's Rav Safra. The Rava disagrees and he says, Lo yishanu ala achar ha-tayrif, aval ifnei ha-tayrif, afilu al peh, nami puzzle. Says the Gemara, this machlekes Rava and Rav Safra. Rava used to tell those who were writing the Gittin, Shisku shtuki lebal ad tekasviu le'letayif tegita. Make sure the husband is quiet until you write the tayrif of the get. As Rava is of the opinion that if even a Tanai said orally before the tayrif is written, is going to be pasul. Continues the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, Kol HaTanayim Paislim Begat Divrei Rebbe. We have machlekes over here. Rebbe and the Chachamim says Rebbe all conditions, all Tanayim that are written pasul begat, but the Chachamim Maimrim no. Kol shepaisel al peh paisel b'chsav. Chshein paisel al peh no paisel b'chsav. It's only going to pasul if it pasels, if it's said, but if it's not pasul, orally it will not pasul even if it's written down. Chutz, except for chutz, not except for, one more time. Chutz, if someone makes a tanai of a chutz, which is a type of tanai shapaisel al peh, al paisel b'chsav. Almanas, if someone makes a tanai of almanas, she'enoi paisel al peh, then enoi paisel b'chsav. So what is this machlekes Rava and Rav Safra? Amar Rav Zira, machlekes of Nei HaTayrif. Excuse me, not Rava and Rav Safra. Excuse me. The last price that we just quoted, Rebbe and the Chachamim, what's that machlekes? Says Rav Zira, the machlekes is Lefnei HaTayrif. The machlekes is if the Tanai is written before the Tayrif. The Rebbe Savar, it's a Gzeira. Because you know Manas HaTuchotz. But Rabbanan Savar, because you know Manas HaTuchotz. However, a Tanai that is after the Tayrif, then says the Gemara, Divrei Akol kosher, such a scenario, everyone holds it's going to be kosher. And what about the case in our Mishnah? Says the Gemara, Masnisa diktani kisvoi, v'kimnoi b'chotz, and we established the Mishnah talking about a case of a chotz. Al manas, loi pasul, but in the case of manas, it would not pasul. That's the first lashon of the Gemara. Or maybe you'll say lachar ha'tayref v'divrei hakol, that what we're talking about is tonight lachar ha'tayref, and then it fits with everyone, could fit in the Mishnah. Excuse me, one more time, I read that wrong. If That is the first explanation. But for Rav Amar, no, the Machlekes Rebbe and the Rabbanan from the bottom of Amud Aleph, from the bottom of Amud Beis, says Rava is Lachar HaTeiref. Why? The Rebbe Savar Gazin Atzal Lefnei HaTeiref, but the Rabbanan Savri Loi Gazin Atzal Lefnei HaTeiref. Avol Lachar, Avol Lefnei HaTeiref, Divrei HaKol Pasal. And then whose opinion of the Mishnah? Masid Zani Kisuf Kimna B'chotz. Avol Al Menas Loi Pasal. Achar HaTeiref, it's talking about a case of Achar HaTeiref, and now the Mishnah could be according to the Rabbanan. So Rava has a Maila, that according to Rava, we have a way of explaining the Mishnah according to the Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, a story to conclude this part of the Gemara. Tani Avud Ravin Kamei Rav Zeira. Kosav get al Tanai. What's the halacha? Divrei HaKol Pasal. So Gemara, 1 second. What do you mean? Divrei HaKol Pasal? V'miflak Pligi. Eleima Divrei HaKol Kosher. Vechi Dami. Lachar HaTeiref. V'leima, wanting you to say he's a Pasal v'Rebbe. Tani Divrei HaKol. The Mishnah says Divrei HaKol. Asnaye Kosher b'Pasal. Asnaye. Excuse me. One more time. Let's read this correctly. Says the Gemara. Tana Divrei HaKol Asnaye. The Mishnah called the case of Divrei HaKol. So kosher b'Pasal, that's a potential michlaf lei. Harezev Divrei HaKol loy michlaf lei. And of course, you remind yourself that Mishnayis, Gemara, Talmud, Bavli, Torah Sheval Peh was of course all transmitted orally. And therefore, sometimes when we want to try to figure out what the correct girsa is, we have to try to dig deep into the psyche, figure out what's a mistake that is plausible to make within trans. And we continue with the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, continuing with the theme of what level of severance, of krisos, is necessary in a get. Says the Mishnah, Harei mutares l'chol adam, ella la'aba u'la'avicha. Someone says to his wife, he gives her a get, and he says, you're mutter to all people. The word ella means chutz, as we're going to see. Ella la'aba u'la'avicha, except for to my father, and lavicha, to your father, la'achi u'la'chicha, to my brother, your brother, la'eved u'la'avichavim, u'chol mishen alav kedushin, or to anyone else that does not have kedushin, halachas, then it's kosher. But if he says, Harei mutares l'chol adam ela la'alman l'kayin gadol, kushav chutz l'kayin hedyet, mamzeres unesin ali Yisrael, bas Yisrael mamzer unesin, v'chol mishe yesh alav kedushin. But if he says to her, you're mutter to everyone, except all the cases in which yeshal of kedushin, it's aser for a gush of chalutz to marry a kohen hadid, it's aser from zeres to marry a Yisrael. But in all these cases, if the marriage were to happen, the kedushin would be taifes, it would work. Then, even though afilu ba'avera, even though of course it would be aser to avera, then the halacha is, then the gain is possible. So says the Gemara, there was a general statement that was said in the Mishnah, and there was a klala in the Reisha, a general statement in the Reisha, as well as in the Seifa. So says the Gemara, klala de Reisha lasuye, the klala in the Reisha, the general statement in the Reisha where it said chomi shein alav kedushin, that's coming to include shar chave krisus. Whereas called the Seifa is coming to include shar chayve lavin, which of course is the general rule, in which we know that chayve krisos, if one tries to marry someone who is aser tim with an isser of krisos, woman to her father, etc., kedushin is not taifes. Chayve lavin, kedushin is taifes. Says the Gemara, that's what the general statement in the Mishnah is coming to include. Continues the Gemara, Ba'imine Rava Mirav Nachman. What is the status? Chotz mikadushay katan mahu. What if the Baal divorced his wife and said, you're divorced for everything except for a katan? Mahu. Mi amrinon hashtem yolav baravayu. It's impossible to marry a katan, and therefore it's not one that one could potentially marry, and therefore the condition is pointless, and the get is kosher. Or do we say, eventually that kid is going to become a kid that's able to be married, and therefore it's considered a tenai, therefore it would not be a good get. Says the Gemara, Amar Le, he responds, Tinitua. Kitana miskaresh says, B'kedusha Yaviyah. Says the Braisa that a Kitana can be divorced by her father. Says the Gemara, Amai, what exactly does this mean that this girl can be divorced? There's a general cloud that any time a person can be divorced, he has to be able to be married. And if a Kitana cannot get remarried, what does it mean she can be divorced? Must mean that she can come into the parsha of Kedushin. Says the Gemara, case number 2, the Rava asked from Menachem. What if he says, Chutz min hanoyladim? What if he says, you're mutter to all people except for someone that is not born yet? Do we say Hashtami Olo Yisrael not born yet? Or do we say eventually the person's going to be born? Amrli again, Tini too always learns in our Mishnah Levet Akum. If you're going to tell me what do you mean? A guy in Eved could potentially become converts. So Hanach Lav Laguri, and therefore we have a raya from there. Says Gemara, no raya, why not? Hanach Lav Laguri Kaimi. We don't say that every guy is waiting to become a ger. Whereas Hani is such a person, if their woman is pregnant already, less the Yulde Kaimi is in the process of being born. But what's the halacha chutz mi bala chaysa? Says the Gemara, if the husband says his wife can marry everyone except for the sister's husband, do we say hashtami ola chazili? Right now, it's not shaykh to marry such a person. There are times that it could be shaykh to marry such a person. What's the scenario if the sister will die? Then, what's the halacha? Shall become fitting to marry him. So what is the halacha in this case? So continues the Gemara, Omar Le, again, Tini Tua, let's bring a raya. It's in our Mishnah Levet Akum. Again, Eved Vakum, 4 lines from the lines. Nami Avidi de Megairi, says the Gemara again. Geiros lo ishchicha. Whereas Misa shchicha, this is a line that we've seen often in different Gemaras, and of course Misa shchicha doesn't mean that people die right and left. What it means is that when you, and this is how the Rishonim explain it, in relationship to Geiros, Misa is more common. Simply put, people die every minute, every hour, every day. Whereas people are not divorced, people are not megayer at such a rate. Says the Gemara, another shayla. What is halacha? If someone divorces his wife, it says that you're divorced from everyone except for having zinus. Says the Gemara, Mao, do we say b'nesuyin alei shayir? With regard to getting married, she's full-fledged divorce and she can get married. Odilma, no. Shayir b'biyah. It's not considered a full severance because Lamaisa, there's an element of Biyah, there's an element of Tashmish, which is limited. Amrle says, Gemara, let's bring a raya to Nitua. Lab Lavicha. Said in the Mishnah to my father or your father, first white line. Pei Hey Amid Aleph. Ubimai, what's the case? Ilim Minasuin. If the case is regarding to marrying the father and her, my father or your father, Avavicha B'nei Nisuin, it's not Shaykh. Elalav biznos. Says the Gemara, and now if it's about znos, only with regard to my father, your father, that's when the Mishnah says it's not considered a shayara. He didn't leave over anything. Why? Because it's not considered shaykh to have biyah with such a person. Halacher, but with regard to something else, having znos is shayir. Says the Gemara, no. Delvin bin Nisuin. Maybe it is talking about Nisuin to the father, the Avar Vinsif. So I'm at a case in which they transgressed and married her, even though it's Aser. Says the Gemara, okay, let's have another Shayla. What if he says to her, he says to his wife, you're divorced, you're mutter to everyone except, there's one thing you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to have Biyah Shaloi Kedarka, that form of Biyah you're not allowed to have. Mao, do we say, nothing's left over, she could have regular Tashmish, or maybe no. Mishkavei Isha Ksiv. Or do we say that it said Mishkavei Isha, the way that a woman has relations, and which means that's where we learn out that both forms of Tashmish are comparable to each other. And therefore, even limiting her that she cannot have Biyah Shelo Kedarka is considered something that is left over. And similar, continues the Gemara with more cases. Chutz me'afars the daramau. Do we say b'nisuin al shayir? Nothing is left over b'nisuin. Al delma isha yikimanav isha yifeirenu ksiv. Al delma isha yikimanav isha yifeirenu ksiv. Or do we say that says in the pasuk isha yikimanav isha yifeirenu? Continues the Gemara with another case. What if the husband says to his wife, "You are divorced except for eating truma"? Ma'u, do we say b'nisuin haloi shayir? Nothing is left over with regard to nisuin al dama, or maybe we say kinyan kasbay ksiv. With regard to truma, it says in the Torah kinyan kasbay that anyone who is a kinyan, the acquisition of money, that such a person is allowed to eat truma, and therefore the gerushin does not work because it does limit at some level her to the marriage of kayanim. Continues the Gemara. What about chutz mi'yushisecha mahu? B'nisuyin haloi shayir, nothing is left over with nisuyin. Oidilma l'sheirai v'yiresh oisa ksif. That one element of marriage is she'er ksos and oinasa. And what does it mean l'sheirai? Then the pasuk continues and says v'yaresh oisa, and that's an integral ingredient of marriage. And therefore, if he retains the rights of Yaresh Isa, therefore they're not fully divorced. And in all these final cases, says the Gemara, Teku, we have to wait for Eliyahu Navi b'siyata d'shmaya to answer all these questions. After dealing extensively with different Tanayim, different forms of limiting in the Gerushin, continues the Gemara in the last line of Pehei Amud Aleph. Let's discuss the actual text of the get. Says the Gemara, Gufay shall get. What is the text of the get? Harei at muteres l'chol adam. He writes that you are mutter to any man. Rav Yehuda Imer. Says Rav Yehuda that you have to add on a different line in the get. That this get shall be to you from me, Sefer Tiruchin, a document of Tiruchin means to throw away, V'gerish Vukin, and a letter of abandonment, V'get Peturin, and a bill of release, Lemahach, Lisnasva l'chol gvar distavson, to go and you can be married, Lisnasva l'chol gvar, to any man, distavson that you want, and that's a regular get. What's Gufa shall get Shechor is Hareat Bas Chayrin, Hareat La'atzmecha. Says the Gemara, Pshita. We begin the Gemara, we are 5 lines down, Pehei Amud Beis, says the Gemara, the following is Pashas. Amar la le'ishtai, Amar la le'ishtai. Someone says to his wife, Hareat Bas Chayrin, he says the same words that are used for an Eved. Lo Amar V'lo Klum, it's nothing. If this sounds familiar, it's because we've had this, we didn't have this, we will have this very soon, beginning of Kedushin. Amar Lav, he says to his wife, Amar La Shivchasa, says to Shivcha, the words of a regular get, Isha Rem Teres Chol Adam, Lo Amar La Klum. So if you swap the terminologies between what one is supposed to say to his wife, not one supposed to, in the event of divorce, one is supposed to say to his Eved, then it is nothing. However, ask the Gemara, Amar La Isha, if someone says to his wife, you are to yourself, Mau. What is the lashon of Harei la'atzmecha kenot? Does it mean legamri karmela, which would mean you're complete to yourself, you're divorced? Ilam lacha karmela. So Amarli Ravina Rav Ashi Tashma, let's bring a right. It's our mission. Gufa shall get shechor. What is the text of get shechor? Yabas chornei alatzmecha. Omay avd the kanalei gufei. And Eved, you own the actual body of the Eved. Kamalei alatzmecha kani gufei. The Eved acquires his body back. Isha deloi kani gufei, a woman that you don't actually own her body, like kolshkin, that it should work. That was the raya that Ravina tried to bring to Rav Ashi. Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi. So continues the Gemara. Ravina le Rav Ashi asks, but what happens? Amar le la'avdai illi esigbach. So we just said a woman works. We brought a raya from an Eved. But what is the status if someone says to this Eved, ainli esigbach, I have no business with you, mahu? Amar le Rav Chan le Rav Ashi, Vam le Rav Chan mechuz noi le Rav Ashi. Let's bring a raya to Shema Ditan. We learned in a brayso. Ha moicha ravdoi li akum. someone sells his eved to a guy, yatzal l'cheiris, the eved goes free, and v'tzarech get shechor. May Rabbi Rishon, he needs to get shechor, a document of emancipation from the first master. Amar Rashbag, b'medvar mamurim, when is this true? Shalkasalav oinoi. This is only true if he did not write. Oinoi means a document for him at the time of the sale. Aval, kasav alav oinoi. But if he wrote a document for him at the time of the sale, zehu shechroroi, that acts as the shechror. Says the Gemara, my oinoi, what's this word? Oinoi, Amar Rav Sheshes, the kasav le, he writes the Eved, l'chativrach mimenu. He writes the Eved, when you flee from him, when you run away from the guy, Einli Esek Bach, which thereby will function as a form of get shechur in the eventuality when the Eved runs away. We continue, we're at the two dots, approximately 20 lines from the bottom of Pehei Amid Beis. We continue by quoting the Mishnah, Rav Yehuda Aimer, V'dan Davi L'chim Yinai, Sevet Yeruchim Yigerish Shvukim. Said Rav Yehuda, he added on this Aramaic line saying that she's free from him and she's mutter to any man. Says the Gemara, B'maika Mifligi. What exactly is the machlaikas between the Rabbanan and Rav Yehuda? What exactly is Rav Yehuda adding on with this line? Says the Gemara, Rabbanan Savri Yadayim She'ein Moichichos Havi Yadayim. So the Gemara pins this machlaikas Rav Yehuda and Rabbanan on a large machlaikas that we have throughout Shas. Machlaikas is Yadayim She'ein Moichichos. When we have a statement which is not perfectly clear, what is the status of such a statement? We've dealt with this extensively in the beginning of the Darim. What is the status of a yad which is not perfectly clear? So Rabbanan Savi Yadayin Shein Mechichel still have a din of a yad, have a din of a partial declaration, and therefore Avakav Lo Kasav Lav Edin David Lechiminai Avakav Lo Kasav Lav Edin. Even though they didn't write this Aramaic statement which makes it perfectly clear what's going on. Muchecha Milsa, it's clear. Clearly, he's trying to divorce her with this wife, with this document, and therefore, according to Rabbanan, there is no problem. But Rav Yehuda Savri, no. If you have something which is not perfectly clear, it doesn't work. And therefore, the only way the get will work is the time of the kasal tikin lamlechi v'din the mucha milsa. That makes it perfectly clear the Bahai Gita Kamigarishla that he's divorcing her with this get. Aval says the Rabbi Yehuda, and this is where he's adding on and arguing the Chachamim. L'kasla v'din. If he doesn't write this Aramaic statement which makes it perfectly clear what's going on, Amri, one might say, b'dibura garsha. He's really divorcing her with dibur. He's divorcing her with words. Vishtara raya ba'almu, and the shtar is merely a raya, and of course that would not work, as the only way to divorce his wife is with the actual get, and this would not have the status of a get. So Rav Yehuda holds, without this statement making it perfectly clear, it would not function as a good get. We wrap up today's shir with Abaya. Abaya, about 15 lines from the bottom. First one in line is Amar Abaye, comes along Abaye and says Abaye, Hi man de kasev gita. Someone who writes a get, and he loy lichtaiv vidain, should not write vidain, demashma vidain. If he writes vidain with the yod, it sounds like vidain, and the halacha sounds like he's only divorcing her because he has to. Ela vidain without the yod, and therefore we know that the word doesn't mean din. Similarly, when he's divorcing his wife, he should not write igeres, meaning a letter of, that's an extra yod. Temashma igeres, that sounds like it comes from the word igras, which means a roof. El igeres without a yod. He should not write limehech with a yod. Demash limehach sounds like li miach, that your wife to me from this point word and from the giving this document and onward. Should not write it with a ches. Sounds like a joke. And the words Tatzban Titzbin Slasa Yudin. Each will be written with 3 yods before the final nun. As you see in the Gemara, credible words, Dal Yod Tav Yod Hey Vav Yod Nun. Similarly, Dal Yod Sadi Beis Yod Nun. You should have 3 yods. Why? Demashma Titavyon v'titzavyon. Then it's mashma, you're permitted and you'll want. V'lurchei levav the tiruchin v'lav the shvukin should have the vav of tiruchin and the vav of shivukin should be longer. The masha tirichin shvikin, because if they're not longer, then they might look like yods, and then it sounds like tirichin and shvikin, which means banished and abandoned. V'lurchei levav dechdu, you should lengthen the vav of kidu, the mashma o kidi, you don't want it to look like a yod. V'loy lech lis nasva, you should not write lis nasva with an aleph, the mashma lo yis nasva, ela lis nasva, rather without the aleph. And then it's perfectly clear what is going on. So Abaye is teaching us fine nuances in the precise writing of the get. The care to be taken, the yud should not be in certain places. The yud should be in certain places. The vav should be slightly longer to make sure it doesn't look like a yud. We'll pick it up with the shayla of Ibayi Lehuv between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan tomorrow, B'siyata Dishmayo.